So the thing about a great story, or a great song, a great work of art, the thing is that even though it exists and it holds its place in history, it stays there even as we come back to it again and again and again. We can experience it through different perspectives, with different vision. We can look at a great story through one set of eyes when we first encounter it, and we can return even decades later to find all the surprises and the challenges and the broader perceptions that have been waiting there all along for us to go ahead and catch up. Like, for instance, Star Wars. You just watch that when you're 8 years old and then again when you're 40. It's a very different story. Especially in regard to gender dynamics, but that is another sermon. Like the great American novel or any great American novel, you read Gatsby 40 times, you get 40 different books. You read the 1960s civil rights sermons of the late great preacher C.L. Franklin, and you will find everything there to admire. But you read them again, remembering that he was Aretha's father, and she sat in the pew listening, and you will hear new things in those sermons. You will perceive in them new patterns. You will learn new lessons. That's the thing about a great story. While it doesn't change on the surface, what we are able and willing to perceive within it does change, but only if we look and look again and let ourselves move beyond what we thought we knew in the first place. Example A, the story we just heard today. The story that our children and youth will be grappling with all month long as our programming really ramps up in religious education. The story you just heard for maybe the umpteenth time, and that perhaps you walked into the sanctuary none too excited to hear yet again. The story commonly known as the Good Samaritan. What is the story telling us? On the first reading, on the 4th, on the 400th. What are we willing and able to perceive in that old chestnut of a Sunday school staple? On the surface, it is framed in an ancient and familiar question, which in every translation has always been attributed to a lawyer. If only because lawyers have been made fun of in literature for about 2,000 years. And I am sorry, barristers among us, rest assured that the only other professionals more worthy of literary ridicule are us preachers. At least you were only made fun of by Jesus and by Shakespeare. Who is my neighbor? The lawyer asks, sitting in that crowd, who is my neighbor? And the way we usually tell that story makes the moral pretty easy and the message pretty safe. Your neighbor is the one who needs you. Your neighbor is the one who shows kindness. So go and do likewise, people. It's not so hard. Be nice. Give a hoot. End of story, right? That's about where it usually ends, but I swear, if we can watch Star Wars more than once, we can have another look at this story too. A story that was originally told by a Jewish teacher to a Jewish audience from a Jewish perspective, and we can try to grasp some deeper truths that are just waiting. If we go deeper, we are forced to admit that beneath the question, who is my neighbor, you can hear a harder question that is still being asked in every nation, in every deliberation today. Not just who is my neighbor, but who is it that I am allowed to hate? If you tell me to love my neighbor, the question poses, then also tell me exactly who my neighbor is so that I know exactly who my neighbor is not. If you tell me who to love, then you better tell me who I don't have to love, because this loving everybody business, it does not sound like what I signed up for. Who am I allowed to hate? That's what the people were gathered together asking in the first century. It is the same exact question people are asking today when we open the newspaper, when we turn on the news, when we walk down the street, When we drive down the Beltway, when we cast sidelong glances at the bumper stickers on the cars next to us, and we cannot get at the answer unless we go back to the radical context of the old story that we thought we had all figured out. So who is it exactly that is lying in that ditch, bleeding, beaten, and robbed? He is a Jewish man. Just like the original Hebrew listeners of this parable, he is a Jewish man, and they are meant to relate quite deeply to his pain, to his struggle, to his fear. And the next two characters that pass by in the stories, they would have known them too, the priest and the Levite, also good Israelites, good, decent Hebrew people who may have plenty of reason to be afraid. Plenty of reason to pass on by and just keep walking on that most dangerous of roads where it makes all kinds of sense to trust nobody. And who is the one who stops? Who is the Samaritan? Modern biblical scholars are often quick to point out that the Samaritans were the historic enemies of the ancient Hebrew people. With a condescension that sometimes veers a little bit toward anti-Semitism, some Christian commentators like to go on and on and on about how the Samaritans were unjustly treated by the Hebrew people. And so the Good Samaritan, the one who stopped, was a man whose people had been systematically mistreated by exactly the kind of guy who lay bleeding in that ditch. These interpretations are not wrong, but they're not all either. Because history isn't one-sided. It isn't a tale told only by the victors, and the truth is that most brutal conflict between people sows seeds of fear and destruction on both sides. The Samaritans and the Israelites, they were the bitterest of enemies, it is true. They traced decades of intractable warfare back to the ancient disagreement about the reconstruction of the temple in Jerusalem. I could go on about this, but I will not. Both of those tribes claimed descent from Abraham. Each of them said they and they alone had the true understanding of the Torah. Israelites plundered and burned whole Samaritan villages. Samaritans brutally sacked and destroyed Judean cities. They had been killing each other for generations. And so to the earliest listeners of this parable, the Samaritan, the one who stops, he would not just have been some poor and put upon stranger. He would have been the personification of the people's worst and most violent enemy. And the man in the ditch, he would not just have been some traveler in need of help. Seeing a Samaritan approach him, he would have been very, very afraid. Because everything he and his people had known, every story they had told, every lesson they had learned over generations of warfare would have taught him that this one who approached him with blankets and bandages in hand was nothing less nor more than an enemy. We call it the Good Samaritan. But if we wanted to reclaim this story for its original jolting impact, for its challenge, especially if we were to tell it to a Jewish audience like the one who first heard it, we would be more accurate if we called it the parable of the good Hamas member. The parable of the loving terrorist. The story of the Al-Qaeda operative who saved my life. What do we perceive when we read the story again? What are we willing to take in from a story we thought was just simply advising us to be nice to people? Who is my neighbor? The lawyer asks. The one your entire soul has conditioned you to hate. Who will save me when I am lost? Those who want to kill you may be the ones who will save you in the end. Now, who do I get to hate? Nobody, not even the ones you have every reason to hate. Nobody. And how do I live in this world of blood and sorrow when I do not get to write anybody off? You live with humility and with the sure knowledge that there is something greater than your fear. And can I tell you something, a sort of disclaimer that feels important, like truly coming from my heart? And can I start with saying the sermons I am not preaching? Firstly, I am not standing in front of you here today, gearing up to preach a moralistic sermon about what you ought to think about Israel and Palestine. I am not doing that. I am not your expert. I don't have it in me. I am also not standing here telling you that our differences in this or any country, political or otherwise, don't really matter, and that we should all just hug and sing Kumbaya and get along. I am not telling you that because that would be a lie. I am telling you that stories that mattered 2,000 years ago still matter now. I'm telling you that the great moral questions and greater moral failings of decent people who lived in a former age happen to be a whole lot like the great moral questions and moral failures that we grapple with today. Because do you know where the ancient land that was once called Samaria is located right now? Do you know what border the road between Jerusalem and Jericho crosses today? Samaria is smack dab in the middle of the Palestinian territories. It is in the West Bank. And walking down the road from Jerusalem to Jericho, that way once known as the Bloody Pass, it takes you across the same border of fear and horror and suffering and violence that the lonely traveler in the story crossed way back in the midst of all those old history books. The Samaritan is literally a dissident Palestinian, and the traveler bleeding in the ditch is literally a Hebraic citizen of a Jewish state. Who is my neighbor? Who do I get to hate? Those questions were relevant then. They are relevant now. And while one could say that everything has changed since those ancient mists of history, from another perspective, we can say that nothing has changed. That the story is just as important, as radical, as demanding and beautiful as it ever was. And not just over there, somewhere else, in a conflict across oceans that may or may not be close to your heart. The story isn't important just somewhere else, but right here in our own nation, in our own hearts, in our own families, sometimes so divided over ideological and identity differences, where battle lines and identities are more firmly drawn today than most of us have experienced since when? Since Vietnam? Since before that? Since forever? Since today, when we look across at our neighbors and wonder who is with us and who against, who is threatening to the very existence of the one we love and who is on our side, who is there to save us and who is worth saving on the road, no matter what, who is worth saving in the end. In some ways, everything has changed since those questions of love and hate and community were first asked thousands of years ago. And in some ways, nothing has changed at all. And that could be the reason for utmost despair. For then as now, the most important issue that arises is not how we perceive a story, but how we perceive each other. What we are willing to see in each other, and how completely we allow our perceptions of each other to be filtered through the lenses of our own fear. The Samaritan walks down the road, and what does he see? A Jewish man, surely, recognizable by his clothing, his cultural cues, his difference. He looks and he has every reason to be afraid. And then he looks again, and he sees a bleeding man. A bleeding man who sees the Samaritan, also recognizable by all the ancient cues, and startles with fear at the approach of an enemy until a gentle hand reaches under his head, and finally he perceives not the other, but the only one who could save him all along. This story is about the depth of our perceptions, what we see when we see each other. And if we have the courage to see that the only ones who can save us then and now are the ones we may have been conditioned to fear or to dismiss. We live in a time of conflicting narratives, utterly irreconcilable realities. You watch different channels or tune in to different sources, and it seems like we are living in different worlds until we look and look and look again and wonder if there is some radical other way to perceive each other, even in the midst of the despair and all that we still have not learned, even after all these many years of telling the same old stories over and over again. You know, the great poet Wendell Berry, He once talked about this despair of the world. And he famously once wrote, "When despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound in fear of what my life and my children's lives might be, I go and lie down with the wood drake. I rest in the beauty of the water where the great heron feeds. I come to the peace of wild things who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting with their light. For a time I rest in the grace of the world, and I am free." And I love that poem. And I love Wendell Berry, but I tell you, when despair for the world grows in me, which surely it does, I do not go to the peaceful forest and lay down with the wood drake on a comfortable mossy bed. I do not find some quiet place by a woodland stream. Do you know where I go when despair for the world grows in me? I go to this all-you-can-eat pizza buffet. It's $5.99 a head, and it's amazing. It's up on Rockville Pike, you know the place, between two mattress stores and a vape shop. I go there. I take my children there. I walk into that place where the people are gathered, and at one table are two teenagers having an awkward first date, and over here are four guys who have done some hard living, tipping a cloudy bottle of something in their soda cups. To the back, there is a 10-year-old princess in a real-live rhinestone tiara presiding over a cake half the size of her table. And there we are, family after family after family, all the people, different identities, different stories, different needs, different challenges, different across the whole scope of this blessed and beloved community that is ours. There we are. Some of the moms clearly looking as if they're trying, like they have a little bit of eyeliner on, and some of the moms like me who maybe managed to keep shoes on both her children's feet. There we are with an ex-Marine making balloon animals and giving them out with so much more abundance than he ever receives back for tips in return. There we are, all the people, and I sit there in that place with all of us gathered on that road we have taken. Let's face it, Rockville Pike is no walk in the park. And we are there, and I look around, and I am not being dramatic when I tell you I look at that place and those people, my neighbors, and I think, I love you. I love you, awkward teenagers. I love you, peddler I have driven by 65 times and stopped for once, who is spending his $5.99 of earnings on a good hot meal. I love my children, the balloon man, the princess in the back who holds the door for my baby son when he leaves. I love you, and I want you to survive, and we are each other's neighbors, and we are each other's people, and no one is expendable. So as I nurse my Diet Coke at the all-you-can-eat pizza buffet, and I know that is an oxymoron, I see that they are all my neighbors and that I am theirs and that I love them, and I know we are all worth saving. Because in the end, that's what this story teaches, that the cycle of violence can be broken, that we can see each other, perceive one another, and bless one another for everything we are. We are each other's people, every one of us, and no one is outside the circle. Let the depth of our perception dig down past our fear, our ancient enmity, our tribalisms, large and small. May it dig down deep, all the way down to the place where love lives. For truly, friends, we are, every one of us, on this Jericho road together.